We are deeply honored to have with us Minister Ishu Sugawara, State Minister of Finance for Japan, who kindly traveled here from Tokyo this morning to be with us today. Japan's Ministry of Finance has been an important champion of resilience for vulnerable communities around the world and was the force behind the establishment of our own disaster risk management hub in Tokyo.
In Japan, on March 11, 2011, 4 years ago, an unprecedented earthquake occurred in this Tohoku region in Japan. Japan suffered extensive damage. A tsunami washed away hundreds of thousands of homes in Tohoku, and many precious lives were lost. I'm still feeling deep sorrow, especially for hundreds of thousands of people who lost their loved family members, relatives, and friends. The Resilience Dialogue was launched in September 2011. Just 6 months after the Great East Japan earthquake. In October 2012, we held the third round of the dialogue known as the Sendai Dialogue. In this Sendai Dialogue, we shared Japan's experiences of the earthquake and its recovery from the disaster with the entire world. The Japanese government has been accelerating efforts to reconstruct Tohoku and promoting comprehensive disaster risk management, DRM, with valuable lessons and up-to-date knowledge to build a more resilient society. We appreciate this opportunity to share how Tohoku, especially its major city of Sendai, has realized strong progress toward recovery and reconstruction. The Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami have shown that no one escaped from the damage of devastating natural disasters once he or she is attacked, even developed countries like Japan. Huge disasters can nullify years and years of development effort and achievement in an instance, and eventually impede long-term goals to increase economic growth and poverty reduction. We are thus faced with the challenging task of preparing for these destructive calamities and making sure that every country has the resources to lessen the impact of disaster. That said, in order to promote advanced investment in disaster reduction, it is important for government to set disaster prevention as a priority issue and incorporate DRM into all developmental policy and planning. In other words, we need to mainstream DRM. In this context, we appreciate the inclusion of DRM as a special theme in the IDA 17 replenishment. Holding the UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction here in Sendai, where people from all over the world discuss these frameworks of DRM, is also a significant achievement. We fully expect DRM to receive much needed emphasis in the post-2015 development agenda, which will be adopted at the UN General Assembly in September of this year. Taking advantage of the earthquake as an opportunity to revitalize the regional industries and cities by solving conventional challenges, such as the aging and declining population, as well as the hollowing out of industry. This bold challenge to become the new Tohoku, a role model for the world, involves both public and private sectors, including companies, universities, and NPOs. This initiative will bring various cases that each country can use a foundation when considering their own DRM measures. One of the exemplary projects already implemented is on establishing the platform that reach and development of R&D of food manufacture industry by industry academia partnership in Tohoku. Medium and small food manufacturers in Tohoku are faced with limited financial and human resources for R&D and marketing. In this project, Tohoku University, one of the leading universities in Asia, provides cooperation in product development and technical assistance to member companies. Also, many companies share the know-how of food product development and marketing with each other. In designing these programs, the Tokyo DRM has utilized the Basic Disaster Prevention Plan of Japan, a document which highlights our experiences with recent disasters and clarifies measures to manage disaster risk. We expect that the Tokyo DRM hubs will continue to contribute improving DRM measures in developing countries by utilizing our experience and knowledge. DRM is often discussed when addressing global environmental change, including climate change. Natural disasters have increased in scale in recent years, partly due to the global environment change effect around the globe. In particular, adaptation to national disaster risk is an emergent issue for small island states and least developed countries, which are most vulnerable to climate change. The Global Environment Facility, GEF, led to CEO Dr. Naoko Ishii, and the newly established Green Climate Fund, GEF, are supporting those countries that are addressing global warming countermeasures. When the World Bank provides assistance in cooperation with these organizations, we hope the expertise of the Tokyo DRM hub is fully utilized. Ladies and gentlemen, natural disaster cannot be completely predicted. However, careful preparation allows us to reduce their impact, properly respond to its devastating effect, and build a stronger society to bounce back from the devastation. We have made strides in overcoming this tragedy and have this opportunity to share how Tohoku has realized strong progress toward recovery and resurrection. I promise that Japan will continue to accelerate its effort to build the new Tohoku, the land of creativity and potential. We will develop a role model for the world to follow and contribute our experiences to helping the international community. Finally, I do sincerely hope that this dialogue today will lead to a fruitful discussion toward promoting necessary DRM measures in developing countries. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ms. Margareta Wallström, who you all know very well. She's the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General of Disaster Risk Reduction. UNISDR's exemplary work in helping to build resilient communities needs little introduction, and we're excited to have you here, Margareta.
Friends, you know that as a collectivity we have every reason to be proud of what has been built over the past decade in terms of institutions, awareness, outreach. And if anything, on that platform now we should be ready for takeoff. So, you know, maybe since this, in a way, I think there are some very strong messages going to ministries of finance here. I'll tell you an anecdote that I had this morning where the whole discussion with 6 ministers from a particularly exposed region of island states. The ministers of finance were the ones that have generated the content of the whole discussion, but they were not there. It was other ministers that were there that then would go home and be sent to try to convince the ministers of finance of the follow-up that they had themselves generated. And I think that's, you know, I think one of the cornerstones really for the resilience scale up for 2015 lies in dealing with something that doesn't generate much of headlines. If a minister of finance and budget and planning takes the big decision to mainstream and put in place the policy and technical instruments for financial planning for resilience and sustainability, unfortunately, it doesn't yet get any headlines. I think our goal is that in 10 years' time, that will be the headline. The second part of the cornerstone for achieving that is really dealing with the extreme poverty and vulnerability and exposure, and giving a lot more focus and very specific priority to dealing with that, so to speak, foundation of lack of resilience in societies, which is a strong part, of course, of the document that is on the table now. What we've been focusing on, World Bank, many institutions, increasingly in the past 5 years, I would say, is to really unpack the economics of disaster risk. And far beyond the immediate losses. Even if a country can really cope with the immediate annual losses, pay for the reconstruction, very few countries in the world can today cope with the annual losses accumulating to the future, pay off, move on. There are huge compromises that many countries are making in, you know, taking other budgets, familiar to many, all too many of you, paying off using the development budget in responding to disasters, even with the very generous international aid that very often is provided these days. Countries do pay themselves most of what it costs to have these multiple disasters, many of them recurrent. So the accumulation to future indebtedness and risk of countries is really what we hope will gather much more attention and work in the coming years in order to deal with what is an increasing risk for countries, sustainability and viability when it comes to social and economic development. At the same time, I also would like to mention again one of the other big risks. As much as we know about the immediate suffering, social consequences of disasters, there is still far too little attention given to the long-term impacts, to the social consequences of disasters, not over 6 months or 12 months, but 5 years, 10 years. Many of you have seen it. Displacement that may look temporary becomes permanent. Demographic profiles of locations changing. And what we very often hear, including in very rich countries, looking back 10 years, what do people remember from the disaster they went through? Very often, all too often, it's two things. It's a undermining of the economic capacity, joblessness, both in the location, but also individuals losing their jobs and never regaining the economic capability, and then its emotional and social consequences. And these don't go away in a few years. And I think if we start looking at it, we will see also severe economic impact to many localities here. And this, the reason why this conference is in fact looking a bit harder than we've done in any previous World Conference on the reconstruction is because many of the consequences of disasters that we don't really have a sufficiently strong understanding of lies in the challenges of reconstruction. That's probably the most complex from a financial, social and political perspective. It takes much longer time always than anyone would like to think of. I know Japan, New Zealand as well, they have 10-year plans for the reconstruction, but that's not really the public discussion. And you know how tough it is to be a leader of a reconstruction enterprise in terms of frustration, political challenges. So I think getting much more attention to what is obvious to most of us here, that disasters are not short-term events, there are medium and long-term consequences, but will have to be part of the resilience scale-up for the post-2015 agenda. And when accepting and understanding these, I think we can make them the foundation for pre-planning how that resilience scale-up can be done. And I know that I'm preaching to some already converted people here on the panel.
First time that I traveled to the region 4 years ago, right after the earthquake, when Shinkansen was not even operating. Now, I had traveled with my NGO friends in a small car with a large generator and food supply and sleeping bags. And when I arrived at the devastated area, I noticed that it was absolutely silent, no sound at all, where there used to be houses and shops and schools and playgrounds and where there used to be people. Disaster losses have averaged close to $200 billion per year. Now, only a little more than 10% of disaster aid has funded prevention and preparedness to build resilience. Now, those of us gathered here today are aware of the significance of prevention and preparedness. But what makes it so difficult to do so in actuality?
Good morning, everybody. I think it's a very good question. And as Margareta said in her opening comments, in the last few years there's been an extraordinary wealth of analysis and critique of where we spend our money and what we spend our money on, and a very clear economic rationale to accompany the sort of moral imperative of investing in resilience and investing in prevention rather than having to spend increasing amounts on relief and reconstruction and the response to disaster. And as that evidence has been building from UNDP, from the World Bank, from many, many other sources, at the same time, we've had this extraordinary global consensus that disasters are going to increase in intensity and frequency as a result of climate change, and we can see the pathway of urbanization, which puts more people at risk in coastal areas here in Asia, in peri-urban settings, etc. So in the last few years, we now have a very complete picture of what we face going forward. But, if you are a decision maker, if you are sitting around the table during a budget discussion, we are asking that you do something that doesn't get rewarded, as was said. It's what our colleague Kristalina Georgieva always calls the dog that doesn't bark. We're asking you to upfront invest and pay for something that will save money over time, but which may not get rewarded in the moment politically. It's the same as buying life insurance. It's the same as taking care of your house, and doing the little repairs. It's a behavioral issue as well as an economic issue. And so therefore, the test of this meeting in Sendai is that we break through the technical conversation about the economic rationale and we move to a political level and say this is common sense, it is a moral imperative, it is an economic rationale, and that we will, all of us, fund development differently going forward.
First thing is that it's not just a link between disaster risk reduction and development. Disaster risk reduction is development. You cannot sustain development if you do not have the capacity to assess your risk and then deal with that risk. And I think the breakthrough we need in thinking now is to go beyond the very important work on early warning systems and preparedness to actually doing development differently so that everything we do is risk informed. And we try not to do things that will set up for failure because they're built in the wrong place, that services are delivered in the wrong way, whatever. So the key message we've brought here is that if it isn't risk informed, it's not sustainable development. Our own mandate tells us to support countries with sustainable development pathways, to develop the governance to make that possible, but critically to build the resilience to lock it in.
Of course, India is a very vast country. When we talk about India, it is very, very difficult to generalize. But as far as the allocation of resources are concerned, of course, as we know from economic textbooks, resources are always limited and our wants are unlimited. So always there is a challenge to optimally allocate resources. But when we come to disaster risk reduction, there are certain issues. For example, since many years we have a system of financing disaster-related activities, but all those are basically focused on response and relief. Only recently there is a realization that we must have some financing arrangement for recovery and reconstruction as and when there is a need. But we are still grappling with that challenge. That's a part of development planning allocation. But here I will give two examples. After some of the major earthquakes, for example, the Gujarat earthquake or Latur earthquake, there were issues of financing of recovery, but we not only utilized the resources of the government, but also from other multinational agencies like World Bank and ADB. In recent times, it has been stipulated by the government that when a major developmental scheme is sent to the finance ministry for approval, along with the technical and financial aspect, there should be a report on the impact relating to disaster risk, whether that particular project would add to disaster risk or reduce it. So that's a very major achievement.
I've said so many times in many speeches and on many occasions what I believe should be done. When we talk from our perspective, it's got to be understood that we are very low-lying atolls, on average about 2 meters above sea level. So the projected rise in sea level by the IPCC are well above what we will be surviving in the future. And so the question as to what we do in the future has been a very difficult question for us to answer. And I can assure you that there is no answer that we can credibly put forward. We have defined a framework with what we believe should be our response strategy. And it requires, if the water is rising, we have to get out of the water. How do you get out of it? We cannot swim for the next century. So either we build up the islands or we go somewhere else. And so we have decided that we don't want to disappear as a nation. So we will build up the islands, whatever comes. And we will do it with partnership. And if not, we will do everything we can to try and achieve that. The alternative is to try and adapt beyond our borders. Okay, so I've been advocating this idea of migration with dignity, providing training for our people so they can be skilled, so that they can migrate as on merit, not as refugees, but as people with skills who can make a contribution to whatever community they decide to go to. But I think we have to acknowledge the reality that the ability of the land to accommodate the current level of population, not let alone a growing population at over 2%, is very, very unlikely. So we have to consider that. Now, what I want to get on to is to make the point that our resilience is really nothing. And we cannot do it on our own. So this is where the question arises, and I've been saying it, I've been trying to, I've always regarded climate change as a moral challenge for humanity, because it's a test for human values. What are you going to do if somebody, and I think my friend on my right has mentioned that we have to work together. We have to help each other. We don't leave anybody behind. And I think that is really going to be tested. Let me conclude by saying that based on the projections, where I believe that people often ask me, so how long do you think you have? And I said, I'm not the scientist, but I think maybe 20 years. But I think what we are finding in the recent storm that we experienced just a couple of days ago, that maybe we don't have that. What we experienced at the beginning of last year, at the beginning of the year, we experienced spring tides. At the beginning of last year, we did experience this. We sustained some damage to infrastructure, a lot of erosion. Some communities found that the seawater was coming into the freshwater pond, and therefore contaminating the waterlands, killing food crops. What we experienced this year in January and February, again, the king tides, is again the same thing, but a lot worse. Damage to a great deal more damage. But what we experienced just a few days ago is a storm. We never get storms in our part of the world. We create storms. And we send them down to everybody else, but we never have it. And this is the first time certainly in my lifetime, that I can recall that we have a storm. And quite frankly, we are still trying to assess the damage. We don't have the capacity. We don't have the resilience for storms. I can guarantee you, we get another storm. That was on the edges of the storm. If we get a storm with the eye in Kiribati, I guarantee you there will be nothing left. Thank you.
Given the complexity of the policy making within the European Commission, are you seeing a solid consensus among the member states and actors that disaster and climate resilience matters? And how does your institution integrate resilience into its operations?
Well, maybe we look very complicated from the outside, but inside I think I have to say that the European Union is actually capable of putting political proposals on the table big time. We were the supporters of the Kyoto Protocol. We have been at the forefront of all of that. I think a number of initiatives on resilience, like Agir Sahel, where we have seen that Sahara is moving south, actually has been dealt with in a very assertive manner from the European Union Commission, but also all the member states, and we are working with the Americans on that, etc., also in the Horn of Africa. So I think the knowledge is there, the willingness to move forward, and up there in the negotiating hall, our people are actually working hard to get a success out of this conference, because I think we cannot leave Sendai without a very powerful statement on disaster risk reduction. I have to perhaps add here that I'm probably the biggest idiot in this room, because I'm throwing, coming from the humanitarian side, 1.3 billion after all these disasters every year. And I feel so stupid. Why is it that I have to sort of continue to do that? That's why I have decided to turn all my collaborators into dogs that are barking. Ruff, ruff, ruff. As you said, Rachel, we have to bark. And we have to bark up at the development tree. We have to tell development guys, you have to focus on the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. You have to look at the risks. Because if you don't get that right, the road that you're constructing will be wiped away by floods. Or the health system that you have constructed in the capital, but you have forgotten the provinces, will be wiped away by the Ebola virus. Or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I will continue to bark, waff, 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 until we get a good result.
What about you, Mr. Starr? What are the challenges for your institution? How do climate and disaster risks weigh in on your operation?
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, it's a huge demand on our humanitarian system. And because of that demand, it actually draws away from the development portfolio. And we've seen the impact of these disasters on the development programs. And I think, echoing what Ms. Clark said and Mr. Sorensen, that we need to incorporate into our development programs that disaster risk approach. And that's one way to take it to scale, as we've said here, is if it isn't just specific DRR programs, but that it needs to be incorporated into all the development programs, that you assess risk, that you don't assume that there will be no drought in the next 5 years if you're working in northern Kenya. You have to assume there will be, and how do you plan and design your programs to address that as it comes out. And a lot of countries are starting to see that as well. Kenya, I think, is a good example, and the Prime Minister, the President, excuse me, on Saturday mentioned this in his speech, the importance of resilience. And they've done a good job of seeing that the lack of development in the northern parts of Kenya have actually caused an impact on their economic and financial system, and that it's actually in their economic interest to put more development into that area, looking at risks there, so that you actually have less of an impact than on the disaster side. So it's important to put those together.
Also, let's take on board what President Tong of Kiribati has told us, that you can assess risk in Kiribati, but if that big storm comes and your land is only at most 2 to 3 meters above sea level, what will happen? There are very, very vulnerable, fragile countries out there in the face of these epic climate events. And that should focus us not just on what we determine we could do about disaster risk reduction here coming from Sendai, but also on COP21 climate change talks in Paris, and the critical need for much more ambition on greenhouse gas emission reduction. Otherwise, we really are condemning Kiribati, Maldives, Tuvalu, and a number of the other low-lying atoll communities of our world to an unthinkable future.
Well, it's very true indeed. What we are finding is exactly that. The first test of how we're responding, the first test of our resilience, if any, was the storm that we've had, and it hit Vanuatu badly. Vanuatu, they've got some high ground. We don't. There was a tsunami warning when the eastern Japan earthquake hit them. There was a tsunami warning issued. Everybody panicked. And the only place they can go to is go to church, say your last confession or whatever. Go to, but you run around, look for your kids. You go and take them from the school, so that, and you go to higher ground. And the higher ground is the sports stadium. And so that is the challenge that is facing us. And I think the question really, what kind of a framework should we have? Does it fit in with any of what we're talking here about? Or are we too late? I mean, what's happened with the climate change is too late. It will keep happening. What will happen to us will keep happening. So it's about recovery, how to get away from what's coming. We know it's coming.
And Dr. Mishra, what about you? And given your expertise, how would the new framework for disaster risk reduction help build resilience?
No, I would like to say two things. For example, after the Yokohama Declaration, we were more conscious about prevention, mitigation and preparedness in contrast to the relief and response approach earlier. After 2005, with this Hyogo framework, we talked about building institutions, legal framework, raising local awareness and capacity. And lot of awareness has been generated. We have talked about disaster risk reduction, mainstreaming. So we have reached a certain stage, but all these we may go on talking about for next 10 years, but we have to see that something happens on the ground. Actually, people who are more vulnerable, how they benefit from all these frameworks and so on. We always talk about good governance, which implies transparency, efficiency, and effective delivery at the national, subnational level. International level also, particularly since we are discussing financing, those principles should apply.
Yeah, I think Dr. Mishra is absolutely right. And let's cast our mind forward a few years and look back and what will have been success. Then I think it's everything that we said in the sort of first round of discussion around changing the way development works. Our decision makers understanding the financial resilience at the country level. Are local authorities and cities able to be financially resilient in the case of what will be a very volatile decade, probably 2 decades, as a result of all of the things that we've done to the chemistry of the planet, but also the way in which development is growing and the demographic imperative around all these new urban areas, etc. But it's also then the bottom up. So do households have access to insurance as well as to other forms of support? But it's not just families, do women? I mean, I can't think of a community in the world where it isn't held together by women as well as men. In fact, primarily held together by women in many cases. And if the woman can't get immediate access to microinsurance or insurance or to credit in order to plant immediately after that disaster, then we're just hobbling people in their ability to respond and their natural resilience that resides in many communities. So I think that it's really about integrating everything that we know about the volatility of the world into which we're moving, everything we know about how to really ingrain resilience in how we work, and doing it from the bottom up and from the top down. And sitting here between a barking dog and a lion of climate action, we will all have to do this together.
And Ms. Clark, Ms. Kite has touched upon the issue of women's participation in these initiatives. And this year is the UN Millennium Development Goals target year. And with the SDGs on the horizon, what is the UN and UNDP's vision for a future that is more resilient to climate and disaster risks?
DRR is not a separate discipline. It is a tool for poverty eradication. This is a tool for sustainable development. So I think it's so important this year with these big global processes that we don't keep things in silos and don't talk to each other. And what I really urge all governments represented at this conference is please take a whole of government approach to the big events this year. What happens here at Sendai needs to be cross-referenced into what happens in the Sustainable Development Goals negotiation and the Climate Change Treaty negotiation and the discussion at Addis Ababa on financing for development, and of course into the Commission on the Status of Women meeting right now on Beijing +20. So let's not stay in our separate departments. Let's have a big vision for setting the agenda for the next generation to speed poverty eradication and achieve sustainable development. Your question started on the issue of women and all the agendas being seen through a gender perspective. That applies very much to disaster risk reduction because the death rate of women in disasters is quite disproportionate to that of men, often for a lot of social and cultural factors. If women aren't able to leave their homes in a culture, how do they escape from a disaster? If they are caring for fragile, older or young members of the family, not so easy to escape from a disaster. So women need input into the disaster risk reduction processes and planning. They need to be part of planning the recovery so that things, when they're built back better, are built back better for them.
Yeah, a lot of people have already been talking about that. In a way, this inclusiveness that you mentioned is a key aspect of what we hope to see. And I think you highlighted, Ms. Clark, about not only the role of women, but sort of generally the role of civil society. It can't just be governments and international organizations like us. You have to involve, as you mentioned, the bottom-up approach, civil society. And then the other aspect I think that we haven't maybe tapped into as well as we could have is the private sector. And they have, first of all, a lot of talents and resources and capabilities to bring to it, but they can also bring some innovation and to do things a bit differently, both at the community level and then as you work your way up. Because building resilience is really about building capabilities at the individual, the community, national, even system level, rather than a project here and there. And so it's important to bring all those pieces together. And so this conference is great because it's talking about DRR, but it's leading into the other conferences that we have coming up on climate change, on the post-25, even the World Humanitarian Summit next year. All those have to be brought together in a holistic approach, sort of internationally, but then even a holistic approach, as you mentioned, all the way down to the community.
I think it's always been the challenge that for small, vulnerable countries, and I think the reality is we don't have the resources, the capacity to have that resilience. The question that I've often asked, and I think I put forward as a challenge to the international community is, what can you do if there is anything that you can do? And but we keep looking for our own solutions because there are times when we begin to ask ourselves, will the international community ever come forward? And I think this is the question. But quite personally, we have resources. And I've said it in some of the statements that I've said, that if we were helped to build our own economic sustainability, that would give us the ability to get at least some greater sense of resilience that we currently have. For example, fish, we have huge fish resources. But what we get in return is around 10% of the value of the catch on the side of the wharf, let alone the retail price, the retail price in the supermarket. So we're talking about billions of dollars worth, of which we only get 10% of the landed value. In other words, a very small component of that. What we're asking is, can our partners, in addition to, if they will come forward with resourcing our resilience, building our resilience, will they help us build our economy so that we can be, to a certain extent, be self-reliant? Can we ask for a greater rate of return on the resource that we have in abundance? So these are the questions. But at the moment, we're not seeing much of that happening. But let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the commitments that have already been made in response to what's happening in the Pacific. I thank those who have responded, and those of you who have not responded, we look forward to your response. Thank you.
Perhaps Mr. Sorensen might have something to respond to that.
Well, first of all, just to say that on Vanuatu, which is not exactly where you come from, we dispersed yesterday 1 million, just like that. I gave the order over the weekend, and we have 2 people going with the UNDAC team. I think they have now taken off from Brisbane, and they will arrive. I hope they can land there, and we'll keep an eye on that. So there's solidarity in the immediate disaster. When it comes to regional organizations, we don't like too much to look at the European Union as a regional organization. We think it's a state in being. We are giving birth to something bigger. But we take this very, very seriously. And I want to come back to what Mr. Mishra was saying about owning your own house, having insurances, banking. What is very interesting is that this agenda here is equally relevant for very developed countries, as well as middle-income countries, as well as developing countries. And it's about resilience all over the place. So we have actually instituted inside the European Union that all of our 28 member states have to come up with risk assessments. We are going to make very brutal peer reviews. We are going to learn from each other. We are going to lift up the level in the weaker parts of the European Union. And then we will look at how we do risk management and how all of that is actually going to be a condition for receiving money from the structural funds, our regional policy. So there's an integral approach here. So it's also about very developed countries. When it comes to developing countries, our development policy, I think we are very committed to the resilience agenda. I am barking, as Rachel, I continue to bark, but increasingly I feel that there are some very nice dogs on the other side, on the developing side, that want to help, that are actually now making sure that the sector programs are focused, as I said before, on the most vulnerable. And we do that all over the geography. So this commitment will stay, and I think if I look at the text that is being negotiated up there, I'm very, very happy to see a commitment to risk assessment and to risk management.
We've integrated disaster risk and resilience into our country frameworks, which is the big strategic dialogue that we have with each of our clients. And we're trying to look at how we should extend this in our private sector investments as well. We're building a resilience indicator, and this is really the key. We have to know that development is actually building resilience, and we need to work out how we're going to assess that over time. And that learning will be very important, I think, not just for development spending, but at the moment we have humanitarian assistance, development spending, and then this whole new climate finance architecture that's being built. And those three things have to be user-friendly to the Minister of Finance, especially in a small country, and they have to build off each other, and we have to be able to take critical and catalytic pieces of public finance and leverage, domestic flows and private finance behind them. So we've changed the way we do business. We haven't, by any stretch of the imagination, got this exactly right yet. We are learning a lot from it together with our partners. We want all multilateral development banks, all bilateral financial institutions to follow suit. I hope that this will be a clear thing said in Addis Ababa of financing for development. And then as we move forward, we'll have to learn more, and we'll have to have a feedback loop. What's working, what's not working.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stahl, what about USAID?
Yeah, definitely the way to bring resilience to scale is to build those capacities within the governments and in the civil society within the countries that you're working in. And obviously incorporating it into the development programs, but beyond that, actually working in those vulnerable communities to build their capabilities and utilize their own resources, capabilities. They have ideas. They've already had to deal with these kind of disasters in the past. They just need the help to use those capabilities. And things like bank accounts, risk insurance, things like that, that will help them to take advantage of the capabilities they already have. And then at the international level, we need to coordinate more closely on these kind of issues, and that's something we're starting to do. We've, within USAID, we have incorporated now resilience assessments and planning into all of our country strategies, and then we've also established what we call a global resilience partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation and Swedish SIDA, and looking at how to affect a better job of doing resilience programming throughout the world through that. And as a part of that, doing some more innovative work with civil society, private sector, more technology, things like that.
So perhaps we could ask each and every one of you to share with us your takeaway from this discussion in about 1 minute each, if that's possible, starting from Mr. Sorensen.
Because I'm a little bit like the canary in the mine. I have people, in the really nasty situations. They know what is coming, and they have to communicate that to the development people. And by the way, they also have to communicate it to the diplomats, because we need much more preventive diplomacy. A number of these disasters are actually induced partly by climate change, but also by collapse of states and conflict. And that's the other big challenge that we're faced with now, that is stealing money out of the very scarce budgets we have. But this conference will contribute in a great way.
It is continuing, business as usual or doing something. And I think we're at a moment in history where that's not actually really what's going on. We are at a moment when we have increased volatility as a result of climate change. We have increased sort of conflicts, stretching people all over the world. And we have this path of urbanization which is unprecedented in human history. And so the question isn't really, we can just do nothing or act. The real question, and the thing we have to internalize and understand, is that to not do anything is the most profound judgment. To not do anything is to act. But to act in such a way as that we will leave people behind. And we know this. We know it. All the evidence and data is laid out by 5,000 people in Sendai. To not act on this is to cast a judgment. And we are not those people. We are better than that. And this year, 2015, we have to negotiate for a much better outcome. And we have to go back and we have to do things differently. We know what to do.
President Kong.
I think it's not what I would like to take away from this conference, but what I would like to leave with this conference. And to leave the message that Rachel has just been saying, that climate change is indeed the biggest disaster that is happening. What is much worse, it's practically irreversible. And the point that I want to make very strongly here this morning is that we are the front line and it's beginning to happen, and I'm telling everybody that it will keep happening. And unless we can do something constructive, unless we can come away from Paris with a positive outcome, I think not only we, the countries on the front line, the canaries in the coal mine, but there will be others to follow very, very shortly. So that is the message that I would like to leave with all of us here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
First, during the last 25 years or 30 years, first we talked about prevention, mitigation and preparedness. Then we moved to DRR, disaster risk reduction. Today we talk about resilience. So our emphasis has changed from a very physical aspect of mitigation and to disaster risk reduction and now to resilience. When we talk about resilience, what it follows, instead of talking about climate change or development and all, we must talk about the capability of those who are most vulnerable. So unless we do that, we cannot achieve resilience of people. And to do this, what we need, not merely more laws, more institutions, we need good governance. Of course, the private sector, the civil society have to play an important role, but the major role will have to be played by the national, subnational and local government. So their capability must be improved. So this good governance means to achieve resilience, we need to improve the capability of the vulnerable people. For that, we need good governance, not only at the local and national level, but also at the international level. So this is the point I would like to make.
Thank you. Ms. Clark.
I think my last point would be to reflect on the situation of countries like Kiribati, who are on a journey to what's called graduation from least developed country status. And when you graduate, you then start to lose various forms of access to concessional lending and other things. But the vulnerabilities haven't gone away because you're still subject to the climate change issues, many to the severe storms and so on. So one of the points UNDP is endeavouring to inject into the financing for development discussion at Addis Ababa, which links back to what's happening here, is that we need mechanisms for states where there are inherent vulnerabilities because of location, to have some understanding that when the worst happens, like a major storm, you don't end up going back to where you were, loaded up with debt for circumstances that were completely beyond your control. So We need to link a lot of the thinking from this conference through to financing for development and those vulnerabilities which actually never go away.
Well, firstly, I think I'd like to say that it's great to see that people are really starting to understand the importance of resilience and the importance of focusing on vulnerability and risk. That's relatively new. Some of us have been maybe thinking about that, but people are coming together on that, and that's huge and that's great. Secondly, that it's a matter of, as you say, the primary responsibility is within the countries and even within the communities and building their capabilities, and we all need to focus our resources on that. Thirdly, that we need to break down the silos between development, humanitarian assistance, and think in a more holistic way toward building those capabilities to mitigate the effects of disasters as and when they happen. Thank you.
Thank you. So this concludes this session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Because nobody can do it unlike that. We'll see this. Okay?